All right, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Um, just like to remind you that we have additional Open October events coming up through the rest of the month. So tomorrow we have a session on ORCID ID. Next week we have a session on using narratives to open science. And then the last week of October, we have sessions going over the state of open access at Washington University, both on the Danforth campus as well as here on the medical campus. If you're interested in any of those, please go to our website, becker.wustel.edu, click on the Open October banner, and they'll have information for all of those sessions. Right now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will allow our guest speaker, John Chodacki, to go ahead and share his slides. And as we're doing that, I'm going to just give a brief introduction for John. So John is the director of the University of California Curation Center, or UC3, at California Digital Library. As the UC3 director, John works across the University of California campuses and the broader community to ensure that the California Digital Library's curation services meet the emerging needs of the scholarly community. That includes digital preservation, persistent identifiers, data management and data publishing. And prior to the California Digital Libraries, John oversaw product development activities at publishing organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Safari Books Online, and PLOS. John currently serves on the board and/or steering committee of DataCite, Force 11, Research Organization Registry, Counter, Collaborative Knowledge Foundation, Open Citations, Metadata 2020, Make Data Count, and the Carpentries. So John has done and is currently doing a ton of work in the area of open science, open scholarship, and open data. And today, John is going to talk to us about Make Data Count, and specifically data citations. He will cover demystifying the hurdles to adopting data citation and outline actionable next steps. With that, John, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay,
I can
great.
see you and hear you.
Great. Thank you for the intro and thank you for having me. Yeah, today I think I'm going to really dive into two main topics that are kind of interconnected. One is the idea of data metrics and what do metrics mean when it comes to research data. And the other is about data citations and how do we move towards a more robust ecosystem for data citations. And so let me just make sure. There we go. Feel free throughout the talk to add comments into the chat. I will take questions at the end and throughout the conversation. Also, if there's any questions or follow-up that you're interested in, you can definitely contact me through Twitter or email. And I'm going to be speaking a lot about the Make Data Count project, so please feel free to follow up with within the Make Data Count website and Twitter account as well. So first of all, what is Make Data Count? As Chris was saying in the intro, Make Data Count is a project. It's a community initiative. It is something that we have as a community come together to bring the conversation around data metrics and data citations. And so just as a first framing, just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Make Data Count, we are a movement. It's a project that is currently housed at DataCite, which is a registration agency for DOIs for data sets. But we're also a group of like-minded people who have come together to discuss the issues and the challenges around data metrics. We do work on projects that help to build, but also to think about how we can advocate for best practices, how we can contextualize data metrics, and we can do this in a more open and transparent way, making sure that we don't fall into the same traps that many of the publication metrics have in terms of black box or proprietary systems that currently drive much of the publication metrics world. And so Make Data Count is a collaboration. It's a cooperative, and it'd be great for people here joining and others to join in on Make Data Count and helping us with the challenges that I'll be outlining today. So let's take a step back and just kind of say, what is this that we're discussing today? So it's clear from the community that we as a scholarly communications and as a research community, we are interested in emphasizing research data to showcase how we value data, and also how we want to evaluate data. So this is really around referring to this idea of credit. So I put credit in quotes usually. Credit is something that is hard to achieve in its reality. It's something that we throw away around the term often. But right now, within the world of research data, and maybe in many other realms as well, we don't really have any standardized way well-adopted, meaningful ways of evaluating research data, especially what the impact of research data is, and also how that impact maybe changes from discipline to discipline. And so there's no real way to evaluate the impact. And so in a sense, right now, we're in a situation where it's very hard for us to assign credit to work and to the discoveries and across disciplines and across areas. That doesn't mean that we haven't tried. There's definitely a lot of work that's been going into data metrics. There have been large investments made into building initiatives and kind of foundational work for understanding research data's impact, different initiatives and organizations that support persistent identifiers or community working groups, or just the quality, the protocols and standards around research data. And not going through each of these things in this kind of timeline that Make Data Count put together, but there have been a lot of people and work that's been done into opening up scholarship, so articles, then also thinking about how articles have underlying data. And so let's talk about how we identify and assign credit to, or assign recognition, I guess I would say, to the underlying data. How do you then connect the paper and the data? And then starting to think beyond that and think like, well, wait a second, what about the data as its own first-class research output? And so there's been this journey that we as a community have been working towards, of trying to get to a point where we can start to have robust data metrics and really start to think about how we can and have assigned credit for research data. But one of the challenges with research data is that data are complicated. We frequently compare data to articles, just as I was mentioning earlier. But they're very different from articles, and they're less understood than traditional scholarly publications. Because of that, they can't be evaluated in the same way. Foundational differences that underlie this issue are part of the reason why we don't yet have the data metrics that we've been working towards. We've spent sometimes parsing these out in the Make Data Count project, and we've got a few use cases that we have been starting to work through. And what I wanted to work through here is with you is like, how is it that, or what were the reasons why data metrics are so hard to tackle? And the first is, data sets themselves can be made up of multiple components, so various sources. They can also be built from other published data sets. They can also be dynamic, so data sets that grow over time. And they can also be versioned. So these are different ways that data is a beast that is very different from what we in scholarly communications have built, the systems we built to tackle things like publications. And so with this, we have to define what is it that we would want to measure or we'd want to see in the world of data metrics. And so there's two aspects of this that I want to get to, and I'm really going to touch on the first one, which is data usage, but we're going to dive a little deeper into the second one, which is data citations. So from the data usage perspective, how do you define what usage means when you have this complexity that I just went through, just at the beginning here of what the possible complexity is of research data. How do you dig deeper into defining usage when, you typically what we would say on the web is usage is something like a page view or somebody coming and grabbing something from a repository, whereas data usage can very much mean are you crunching that data? Are you using it in analysis? Are you wrangling it into and normalizing it against other data? You're actually using it? And how do you do that when a lot of that additional usage is happening outside of the repository? Very often it's not something that can be tracked by a repository. And so what does it mean to define data usage? Is it page views and downloads? Is it something more? Also, how do we, even within the realm of page views and downloads, how do we make sure that repositories from one repository to the next or one data center to the next, how do we ensure that they're really, that the data are comparable? So we have here just screenshots from a couple repositories that say, this repository has 30 views and this has 30,000 views. Are these really comparable? And so one of the things that Make Data Count and the group of people around Make Data Count have been working on is thinking about how we can create a standard for counting data usage. So we wrote this first draft of an outline of a preprint of this that was put out for comments and for a conversation around a code of practice for how to do this, how to track that usage, those usage stats. We've sent it out for public comment, and then we ended up publishing a version 1, and we're currently in the process of working on a version 2 of a code of practice that is leveraging a system from a group called Counter. And as Chris mentioned, I'm involved in Counter. It is a group that's been around for quite a while that's focused on how to track usage of publications and journal articles and the kind of library institutional space. And we've worked with them because we want to take that kind of idea of normalizing and standardizing usage information and seeing how we can apply that to research data. And the goal here with this type of work is not necessarily to say that we can tackle all the complexities. It's trying to think about the first steps towards just normalizing and normalizing all of the information that's out there across repositories. Because we know that currently it's very much done on a one-by-one basis, and we want to have a system where people can start to audit the usage information that's out in these different locations. And so there's definitely data usage initiatives out there. I'm talking a lot about Make Data Count, but also an RDA usage group that we've been working with and working through to build a consensus around how data, downloads, views, and other usage can be tracked and normalized for really auditable information. And the goal really, as I was starting with, is for us to start to build foundational information so that data metrics can be trusted and can be auditable, and something that is responsibly managed. But let's talk a little bit about data citation. So, the goal of this talk here is really to think about within the data metrics space. Make Data Count is an initiative that's working across data metrics in general and really has segmented things into usage and citation. So, but let's diving into data citation. How do we manage and see kind of the future of data citation and where we've been and where we're headed? There's a couple things that are obviously different from a data citation than from a regular citation. There are different ways that people cite data. It can happen when researchers cite data in an article, or when they cite data sets within other data sets, of course. But most commonly, we refer to data citation as it appearing in reference list or in a data availability statement at a journal. And just like data usage, it is essential that groups get together and figure out what is the best way of practicing citing data, right? So wanting to ensure that there are audible ways to create responsible data metrics and data citation practices. And so this has been going on for quite a while. There are groups that have been working on data citation for quite some time. One that I would highlight is Force 11. So if you're not familiar with Force 11, it is a community group that includes stakeholders from students, researchers, as well as librarians and publishers and tools builders. It's really one of the few places where people across the entire scholarly communications kind of research support communities comes together and talks about common challenges. And in 2014, they came together and pulled together groups across the community to discuss data citations and what is it that we wanted to do to create kind of foundational normalization practices. So similar to what Make Data Count's been doing with data usage and the counter code of practice, the question was back then, how do we create common understanding of citing data? What is it? What is the format? Everything from best practices within the journals, but also just how do you do citation formats for data? And what they came up with was a set of principles. And I'll be going through a couple of the kind of next examples that that team came up with. But if you're interested in the principles, what was it that they were trying to ensure? I would recommend going to the Force 11 website or following the DOI that's cited here. And I can make these slides available. But really what we want to do is think about what is the unique nature of a data set and what are some of the things that we would want to ensure with the data citation. And I'd say one of the key highlights I'd put there is that citations, just like when we're doing journal or article citations, we want to make sure that the citation itself is machine readable. We want to make sure that that if you're using a citation manager or a system for doing meta-analysis or something, that you are able to mine that citation for additional metadata. And so having normalized information is very important, and making sure that that information is available through a DOI or another identifier is very important. And so these principles that are outlined at Force 11 are really important for people to take a look at, to understand kind of what are some of the background information that goes into data citation. But I was thinking who thinks about these things day to day, like what researcher is actually going like, oh, I really want to focus on the anatomy of a data citation. So I thought I would just spend a little bit of time going through this, but not focus on it too much. But, there is this need that a citation itself is a little nugget of information. It should provide significant information to identify that the cited data reference, but it also should not go too much into the complexity of that data. We do need to make sure that data citations do highlight components of data. As I was mentioning, in the complexity of research data, there are many different ways that research data can be chunked up or used. If somebody is citing a data set that is, a longitudinal data set that, could be in the gigabytes or petabytes, like how do you know which aspect or what component or even which row someone is using in that space, or what timestamp someone's using in that data set? These types of things, these indicators are important in a data citation. However, we have to be realistic. There's no way for us to be able to get to the very nitty gritty inside of just something that's a small string. So we want to make sure that there are very, very common, well adopted components in a data citation. And of course, the most important would be a global persistent identifier. And so things like DOIs. So a DOI is one type of an identifier. I mentioned earlier DataCite as an organization that does offer DOIs, and many institutions, including Washington University, are members of DataCite and offer DOI registration. But if you go to data repositories, very often they will also offer DOIs as one of their identifiers. Regardless of what identifier it is, it's very important for it to be resolvable and for information to be able to be gathered from that identifier. And those being included in a citation is very important. And so we have this kind of this need kind of to have a common set of information within citations. And these need to follow those principles. So as I was mentioning before, the set of principles that guide us need to be things that are ensuring the information that underlines the citation is something that is open. Regardless if the data set itself needs to be closed for privacy concerns, we need to make sure that information about that data set is open so that we can track and understand what the relationships are that we're making when we cite data. And so these are just, interoperability, reusability. These are all important aspects of data that are unique to data because of its nature. But it's also something that needs to be dealt with in a responsible way, so that we ensure that we're not creating dead ends or not allowing for verification and auditability when we are creating citations. The other important thing around the data citation is that it in itself is not it's not as important for us to focus too much on different types of formats. Like, data citation is a relatively new convention inside of scholarly publishing, and what we're trying to focus on is pointing people to the actual source of the data instead of focusing too much on the style of the citation. And maybe one last thing I would mention in terms of data citation itself is that the citation metadata can be expressed in many different ways. So there is the citation that you might put in a reference list, or you might track in your citation manager, but it's also something that we want to ensure that type of information is available at the repository. So if you go to a repository, you can also find that information about the data set. So when you publish your data sets, that landing page, that information page about the data set is also including that information. And so we have a lot of kind of depth about this. And if you're interested in it more, there's some links in here to the Force 11 principles and some of the best practices. I think that there's the general idea here is that a lot of thought energy has gone into not just thinking about the style, but also thinking about the principles and the governing ideas around why we want to do data citation in a certain way. But back to the bigger question, the goal here is for us to be able to create something that's a meaningful, responsible metric for research data. And so the question that we have is, even if we create citations and we put them in places, they're not yet metrics, right? We don't necessarily have data metrics. So how do we get there? And we have had several bumps in the road. We have had challenges getting adoption in certain places and in certain groups. And so one of the things that I would bring up is a little story around citations in general. So many people don't know, but citations within journal articles have for many years been thought of by publishers to be something that they own. So the citation is part of the document, it's part of the article, and publishers either implicitly or explicitly have said the reference list that we published falls within the ownership of that we declare over the content of the article in general. And what that has meant is, like, many people who have built citation indices or have tried to get involved in that type of those types of projects have been nervous to jump too much into that because they're afraid that they're going to run into legal concerns with publishers. And I mean, it's always been somewhat of a kind of not really well understood why that would be something that could be owned by a publisher. In US law, at least, a declaration of a fact is something that is part of public domain, and the connection between two entities can be defined as a fact. And so the question was, why is it that we are letting publishers kind of hold this very simple connection information hostage? And the answer for that has been for the community to push back on that. But in the meantime, what has happened is most citation indices that we rely on are proprietary. They are themselves owned by the same publishers. And so one of the things that we are working towards with Make Data Count and with data citations in general and in the world is, how do we build something that is built in a way that is more open from the ground up and with the right declarations of ownership from the very beginning? But on the publication side, the continue the story, I mean, on the publication side, what has happened is the community has started to push back. There has been an initiative that's called I4OC, which is the Initiative for Open Citations. And that has advocated very successfully over the last 5 years for publishers to open all of their citations and declare that they can be open. And a publishing group, Crossref, working with the publishers, has made it from where there was just a small percentage of publishers who publicly declared that their citation information was open to now nearly 100% have. And so we've really shifted the discussion. But what was interesting about that when it comes to data citation is that during this journey of people talking about citations information being closed or not being closed, data citation was emerging. And it created a situation where we were talking to people about adopting data citations and including them in their journal articles. And we were wondering, well, if we want to create a data citation and a connection between the two items, what could we do that would ensure that it's elevated to a place where everybody could see it? And since people were very nervous that citation lists were closed, a practice started, which was called a data availability statement. And it was kind of a hack for the publishing world to move away from move information about a connection between a data set and a paper and move it into something that would not fall into the legal wrangling issues of a citations list. And so now that we've fast forward several years and we're in a situation where people are agreeing that citation lists are open, we've now got two competing kind of conventions out there, this data availability statement convention and a data citation and a reference list. So we're just as a community kind of coming back and saying, well, the only reason why we were advocating for data availability statements at the beginning was because we were worried that no one would be able to find them in the legal issues. But now we're all agreeing that there aren't those legal issues. And so like, maybe we should reevaluate the way that we do things. And so this is weird kind of Scalcomm's publishing world, situation that really confuses a lot of researchers and confuses ourselves and has created some confusion in this space. And so, we have to move to a place where we're starting to use similar conventions, but we also need to remember that just creating those connections, those connections between two entities and creating the count there, they're not actually meaningful metrics. They're just counts, right? And the reason why we're not at the point yet to build truly responsible, transparent, open, and meaningful data metrics is because there's a journey, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we're just at the very, very beginning. And so, as I was kind of walking us through, we have this situation where, several years ago, people coming together through groups like Force 11 or RDA or Make Data Count, and they're talking about what are some community best practices. They run into barriers like the legal issues around citation lists. So they kind of get off track and start talking about other things like data availability statements and then get back on track, and different things are going on. But those community best practices have started to evolve, right? We now have those principles from Force 11. We have the counter code of practice for data usage, and we have those. And then we start to talk about how do we adopt those so we can have researchers cite their data. That's great. We really can have publishers support it much, much better. These things have become more and more important and well adopted. But there are other issues as well for us to get to when it's to take it from just being counts of things to something that's truly a data metric. And that is a lot to do with contextualizing. So it's a lot about how do we look at kind of the future of data, those counts themselves being thought of as like, what is in what domains are they from? What is the community practice within those domains? How does the usage of that fit in with the complexities that I was bringing up of data themselves? So like, how do we contextualize within the discipline or within the nature of research data so that we can ensure that the metrics that we're creating are actually meaningful. And that needs to happen before we can start to think about evaluation or incentivizing. And this is like kind of the journey towards what I would call quote unquote credit. And so where are we today? So, I've talked a lot about this, the world of data metrics, how we, at least at Make Data Count, have dissected it into usage and citation, talked a lot about the challenges and some of the work that has been done to address those challenges. But, what has that meant? Where are we today? So, researchers currently today, they publish their articles, they publish their data, their software, maybe they make it available, or they're just starting to understand what that means. There's mandates that are coming out more and more that kind of say, you should do this. This is best practice. So we're receiving, kind of creating more and more awareness at different levels of institutions and funders. And as research supporting stakeholders like librarians or research IT, these groups, we start to want to help with those compliance issues and those compliance guidelines that come out. We're starting to then bring the institution in more and more. And really, that starts to bring in the conversation of what is it that, what is the ROI of the open data? What institutions and researchers start to say, well, what is the ROI of this data, these data packages? And also, what is the impact and reach and the influence that our institutions are having? So as we're starting to build this awareness of what we're doing, we're starting to see like, okay, well, then we do want this credit. We do want to be able to have this credit. And so one big piece of these is data citations, of course. And it's not that they're the only indicator that should be used, but, from the bibliometrician side of things, as those bibliometrician studies ramp up, we need to be able to kind of have source information that can be leveraged to create information so that we can start to answer some of these questions. And so as we're on that journey towards data metrics, where are we at? So here's some information. It was pulled last year, has not changed much since then. And this is the kind of taking the world of DataCite and the world of Crossref. So as I was mentioning before, DataCite being a registration agency primarily focused at data and software, and Crossref one that's focused on publications, and seeing that there are millions of data citations that exist, but the number of these that are declared and findable is really low. So we know that people are making connections between data and papers. We know that. But when you go to the actual registration agencies and you look them up, they're just not there. And so what we're showing in this slide is it's not only the lack of participation, but it's also to acknowledge how important it is that they be accessible, right? So it's not just enough for us to just do things in a hack or in our own conventions. They have to be done through best practices and through ways that are very well understood, so that they can be leveraged by bibliometricians, so that we can get towards something like we were talking about with kind of credit. And so why aren't we there yet for data citation? I mean, a big reason why that is kind of, some of it goes back to questions like I was saying earlier about the kind of the weirdness of the Scalcoms world, and how we have built hacks along the way for understanding the connection between data and software through things like the data availability statement. But it's also just because we start to get into the complexities that I started the talk with, right? Very often people will, even though there's a well-established convention for data citations and there's an understanding of where it should go in the reference list and these types of things. Even today, you'll be on webinars where people are like, whoa, data are really complex, data citations are really complex. Let's take a step back before we get started. And I think like that is one of the big issues. It's just a mental barrier within the publishing world, within the scientific world of like, oh, if I'm new to this discussion, then that means that I have to start with the edge cases, with the complexities. And also, we've got this situation where there's been a lot of guidance along the way. Within the story of the kind of open citations world, I was bringing this up, like we've created a legacy of different types of guidance that exists for researchers. And so just people not really understanding what they should or shouldn't be doing. And that is really on the fact that over time, the guidance itself has actually changed. But there's also this question of resources versus priority, right? It's much easier for us to talk about the questions like, what is the ROI? How do I get credit? Than it is for us to talk about like, how do we build that contextualized set of information? And how do we start to build a code of like a practice, a community of practice that gets us to a place where bibliometricians can actually leverage data metrics, data counts for data metrics. And so there's this kind of this mix match of resources and priorities. And maybe one last thing I would say is that there is a really a long tradition in the data world of using non kind of connected resolvable identifiers. So DOIs are great. I've mentioned them several times, but most data repositories that have been around longer than 20 years are not using DOIs. They're using some identifier like accession numbers or something that don't uniformly resolve to metadata. So they're great, but they aren't best practice, because when you put them, you can't put them into a URL and get a package of information back that allows for us to connect across multiple sources. And so what we end up with is a lot of established data repositories aren't necessarily doing what we have said we would like for them to do yet. And so we're still trying to figure out how to make that happen. And so why aren't we there yet? I mean, there is this aspect of waiting until, people saying, well, it's very complex, and so it's not perfect yet. And so I'll just wait. I'm not going to put data in my citation list. I don't really know. No one's addressed this one edge case yet, so I'm going to wait. But it's also because we are, constantly reinventing the wheel and telling people that there's a different, unique way of doing something. And also it's because there just isn't critical mass yet, in a sense. Like it's one of these things where people, and many times say, well, I don't really know why I would do it because I haven't seen anybody else do it. And I'm not sure why, how does it fit into self-citation or other kind of traps that I've seen out there in the publication world. And so I think like one of the big things that we're talking about is really this idea of like, when will it become such a critical mass of citations that people will start to assume that it's just something you do, and like, how do you get past that threshold? And so one of the things that we're looking towards at Make Data Count and in general is like, how do you do this where you've got these roadblocks that are in place for our community and this research community and the people who support research, that community, both communities are at the same point where it's like we see a path forward. We understand that if we want research data to be valued and for people to get credit for research data, we need to support these kind of just foundational counts and metrics type indicators in a more robust way. However, it's hard for us to invest in them when we are not seeing some level of critical mass. And so we're in this log jam of like, what is next? And so the other log jam that we're in is, how do we get publishers to retool and to support processes that in the past they have found hacks to get around, and they have already done some implementation, right? So they've already maybe offered a data availability statement, and now they're like, well, why should we change that? And it's like, well, there's not a normalized way of doing it. And so in many ways, we're kind of thinking about, it's culture change. It's a culture change, not just the researcher culture change, which many people focus on, but it's also the publisher community and the library community culture change. And maybe one last thing I would mention is that we have we rely very heavily on proprietary sources of information. And so it's not ideal, but many people will just say, oh, well, I'll go to Scopus or Web of Science to find stuff, not knowing that there is no like magic out there that allows them to have more information than anybody else. And in many ways, it's not auditable or transparent or really understandable how they're deriving the metrics that they are, the connections that they're creating. But it's something that's just familiar. And so there's this idea that maybe proprietary sources might be something that we'll all rely on. And so, these traps, these things that we're talking about, there are things that we can overcome, but it's something that we need to kind of have a plan for. And so really there's these kind of 3 action steps that we're working on as a community. And, the first 2 are really about kind of reinforcing the path forward that we've been on for a while. We want to make sure that publishers and repositories, they normalize against something like a counter code of practice for their usage, but they also are supporting and engaging in data citations in a way that is normalized against the principles from Force 11 and other places, as well as the actual citation practice. The other is, really normalizing the community, that culture change around how do we ensure that there is the perfect is the enemy of the good, and how do we encourage this like movement towards something, and we're not just getting paralyzed by complexities, that we understand and we recognize the complexities, but we're moving forward through those complexities. And we want to make sure that those are continued. We have to build an infrastructure of sharing and creating citation information. It's a requirement for a robust future that allows us to build data metrics. At the same time, we need to be able to think outside of the box. And so there's no discounting of the importance of each researcher citing their data, citing data that's used inside of data sets that they leverage, or they're publishing, but also in the journal articles they're publishing. Absolutely. In addition, we need to start having a way of getting to a critical mass. I mean, these connections are out there. They actually exist. And so we need to start thinking about how we can start to build a corpus of data citations. So like mentions of when data sets are being leveraged in the literature, like how do we build a corpus that will actually kind of get us to a point where we can recognize numbers that are higher than those that I was showing earlier. We know they're out there. We know that people have been doing this for hundreds of years. They've been saying, this is what I used to do my experiments, my research. So how do we do through text mining or other methods? How do we find ways of declaring and creating an open corpus for people, including proprietary systems, to leverage so that we can have an open and transparent set of information that can really create those connections. So on the one hand, we want to ensure that we're retooling and changing the culture. On the other, we want to build a set of information, a test set that can then help us with this question of how do we get to data metrics. And it's really about trying to kind of move us beyond step 2. Like, how do we get to a point where we can start to contextualize and use them and use data metrics, data citations, data usage metrics in evaluation? Like, how do we get beyond where we are right now? And so it's this multi-pronged approach that we're trying to focused on that's not just about helping individuals and helping publishers do better, but it's also about how do we at the bibliometrician side and within the infrastructure side build better source information. And so that's kind of the end of the talk. We did a set of people from Make Data Count came together and did work on a book called Open Data Metrics that outlines quite a bit of this. So if you're interested in it further, it's a free open access book. It's available for download. Feel free to take a look. And then, as I was mentioning before, I'm available to connect with on Twitter or through email. So looking forward to the Q&A.
All right, great. Thank you so much, John. We've got a couple questions that came through the Q&A, and then I have some of my own. And if anybody would like to, feel free to keep typing your answers into the Q&A. But if you'd like to unmute, and you're not able to unmute, but let me know if I have the ability to let you talk. So let me know if you'd like to. Chat as opposed to typing something in. But we'll start with Marcy has a couple questions here. I think we'll go with this first. So could you expand on the idea of data availability statement compared to data citation and bringing those two things together? It seems they are a little different, and the data availability statement is a statement about where the data generated during the study lives and is shared, while paper reference list would be an author would cite a data set that existed prior to the publication and was used as a regent, so to speak, to do the research being reported in this paper.
Yeah, so I mean, this gets into the question of, I guess it gets into several questions around like self-citation and duplicate citations and contextualizing what is being used in the paper versus what was a source information for the paper. In general, through groups, to jump to the end, in general, it's well established that researchers should be citing their own data in the reference list for their papers. This is not considered duplicate citation or self-citation. Most journals have very explicit policies that allow for that. It allows for a connection to be made in a reference list. It's very clean, it's very simple. Data availability statements themselves were first started, as I was mentioning, this as something that would kind of allow for people to see those connections between data and papers in an open way. So it's just a reliable way to ensure that the information was open. Now we're seeing that reference lists are being considered open very much by publishers, and so we're not running into that same issue. The one thing that I would say about data availability statements is that it's not part of the full text. It's kind of in this weird world of like, it's metadata, but not metadata. So if you run into situations where you're doing like text mining and information gathering of a data of a paper, you're not going to see that in the full text normally. And if you do a text mining or data mining of the metadata, you're not going to find it there either. And so it's this weird in-between publishing systems set of information that's not reliable. So it's one of the reasons why people were really pushing for data citations to be in citation lists. It's also why the more information you put into a data citation, the less useful it is. So many times if people are doing that, we would recommend that you put that in a methods section or in another section of your paper.
All right. Next question. There are a lot of biomedical repositories that are well established that don't use DOIs, as you mentioned, including many NIH-supported repositories. Are the NIH and others actively thinking about this as they move forward with the new NIH data management and sharing policy? And I will add that I was reviewing a data management and sharing plan for going into the NIH under the new guidelines, and they had to submit to a repository that did not have DOI. And so we were writing a section, in the NIH data management and sharing new outline that says, how is this, what are the persistent identifiers? And we're putting in one of their own repositories, and they don't really have a persistent identifier. So
yeah, exactly.
Just adding that as a little anecdotal story onto Marcy's question here, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all hopeful that the world will normalize around one approach. It's hard to steer a ship, or whatever the metaphor is. I mean, so two things that I could add. One is that in the last couple of months, NIH has joined DataCite as a member, which is a huge change from their stated policy or perspective even a year ago. So I think there's definitely some warming of kind of adopting community practices within the NIH world. I'm not saying that they've kind of publicly stated they're going to switch, but there is this kind of idea, and I think a lot of that comes from there is a Office of Data Science Strategy at NIH that's kind of trying to lead these conversations around how do the institutes come together. It's going to take a long time. I mean, if it's ever going to happen. I think that one of the things that we need to be focused on is maybe what you're bringing up, Chris, is like the role of a persistent identifier, and what does we want out of it. And many times people are focusing on the persistent side and on the identifier, but there's also this aspect of resolvable. Like we need resolvable identifiers, and that is because the information about stuff needs to be retrievable by using that identifier. And that is something that I think is what will break the logjam of some of these questions at NIH and others of why they should use DOIs, is because many of the identifiers they have been using, while they're great for them, they have not been focusing on that resolvable aspect. And so I'm hopeful.
All right, next question. PLOS has required authors to make data available. Do you know if they implemented additional steps with their reviewers to ensure that the data is also appropriately cited? Are there any other publishers emphasizing the importance of data citations to peer reviewers?
I mean, I can't speak for kind of where PLOS internally is right now. I mean, when I personally did work at PLOS when the data policy was first launched, and it was not something that the reviewers looked at. Okay. And so I would say that in general, publishers that have had data policies or that are looking to incentivize data policy, like data sharing, they have not, they're on a journey. Like they maybe have started off with not having reviewers look at it, and they're moving more towards having them look at it. I think the challenge in general is like, at what level are you having people look at stuff? Yeah. And one of the things I would say is that there's a value in choosing the right data repository as well. I am a big proponent of using repositories like Dryad that actually offer curation, so that there are eyeballs looking at data sets as they go in. And that's not just to look for fraud or something like that. It's more just to make sure that data are structured in a way that can be reused, that are future-proofed at some level. And that's one of the biggest problems that I think that many people are looking at data review for peer review to be something that happens so that we can kind of ensure reproducibility. And it is an important piece of the puzzle. But even before that, it's like, is it something that you could actually open? I mean, that is like, you'd be amazed how many, we're involved in the Dryad project, and it's like how many times you get submissions that are just, they're data sets that nobody could ever open. And so it's like, just from the interoperability, reusability perspective, even before we would get to reproducibility, I think it's key.
And Jennifer has a great question, but I want to ask one piggyback question on that. So, you mentioned that at the time that the, PLOS implemented their data policy, there wasn't any changes, and nothing happened as far as reviewers. What I'm wondering is, we have this new, there's the NIH policy coming, but there's been other policies. The NSF has a policy. The NIH has their genomic data sharing policy. I'm wondering, and I'm not sure if you would have this insight, but after any of those policy changes, do you think there was any significant shift, like community-wise? Because thinking about reviewers, and if PLOS implemented this and didn't really say anything to their reviewers, if I was a reviewer, I wouldn't know to look at anything different. I wouldn't check anything. But after this change comes in, and so many people, after these policy changes come in, and so many people within a discipline have to shift their practices, do you think there will be any, or in the past, when during the implementation of like genomic data sharing or the NSF's data management policy that includes data sharing, do you think there was cultural shifts that maybe people became more educated on what to look for, how to look for that, or do you anticipate that after the NIH's new policy goes into effect?
I think this is getting a little bit into peer review and the value of peer review.
Yeah.
I think if you're somebody who really thinks that peer review is something that is essential from like a quality perspective, then you have one perspective. And if you're somebody who's like, peer review is just kind of, is something that could just happen post-publication, and it's through the community could vote, you have another perspective. I mean, in general, I would say that publications and across the board have had a problem with this idea of auditing the data underneath the experiments. And it has not necessarily been from data sets because they haven't always been published. It's actually been through figures, like manipulations of figures or images. And that's something that I think publications in many ways needs to focus on first at some level. Data sets can be audited and they can be reviewed, but it's complex and it's different and it's not that. So I think that publication workflows should remain publication workflows, in my opinion, and that data set workflows should be data set workflows. And so I think we need to kind of think of the future of this kind of peer review as being somewhat of a partnership. And we have seen that in the past, like domain repositories do very high level curation and they do very high level review. And so we're kind of talking about this in different ways, but like there are communities of practice that have been around for a very long time, and we just have to kind of think of them as kind of models for the future for the rest of the repository world.
Great, thank you. And I want to get to Jennifer's question in. So she asked, what do you think of using a metric like a FAIR score for data quality?
I mean, I've been involved in a couple projects that have tried to do that. I mean, FAIR is something that is well written as a document, but it's very difficult when you start to try to create some sort of score off of them. Once you go through each of those little statements within the FAIR guidelines, you start to realize that like the findability ones and the accessibility ones are the easy one, and the I and the R are the hard ones to measure programmatically. And that's kind of where we're at when we read them as humans. So, I mean, I feel like that makes me feel like creating a score off of them is just as opaque as any of these other scores that are out there. So I'm not saying that you can't create a score or a metric or an idea that does showcase the aspects of what FAIR's getting at, but I haven't seen something that actually uses the FAIR document and the FAIR principles, the actual statements in a scalable way that's auditable and open, transparent. So I don't know if I would really focus on that personally.
All right, I'm going to squeeze one last in because I've got a couple of minutes here. Is I had heard a few universities mention you starting to use open data sets in their, for promotion and things like that. And I would have initially thought like, cheers, yay. But it looked like you had that, there's a couple more steps we need to get to before we get to that. So what's your thought on that? If a school is currently using data citation or open data as a way for determining promotion for researchers or things like that?
I mean, they're different. I mean, I've heard of different approaches, and I'm not an authority on this at all. So, I mean, I've just heard a couple. I know within the UC system, UCSF has been very as a medical school has been very forward thinking in terms of this. I think the approaches that I like within that are more ones that are saying what are the three most impactful or data sets or outputs that you're proud of. It's less about saying which ones are the ones that get a better count when you go to Google Scholar or H-Index or whatever. It's more about like what you're proud of. And I think that it's about within communities of practice, within disciplines, there's an understanding of what are things that are actually impactful. You don't need impact factors to tell you that. You understand it. And so getting away from finding indicators that are built by somebody out there in the wild is less important than just kind of being proud of or showcasing your best work. And so I think like the new innovations and like tenure and promotion stuff is, I think this, these ideas are like, what are the three most recent, what are the three most, you're most proud of kind of things. And I feel like that is something that we need to move more towards. And so it kind of starts, it's basically creating a conversation. It's more contextualized.
Okay. So we shouldn't go click download on all the data citations and try to, no, I'm just
yeah. I mean, I have a great, I know we're out of time, but I mean, we were talking about, this idea of counter code of practice and this idea of like normalizing usage information. I mean, we worked with this repository on on a project as part of that, where all of their usage information, once they went through and started normalizing it against the code of practice, they realized like magnitudes of hundreds, thousands. They had been overcounting because they had been counting bots that just had
Wow.
been like clicking on stuff. And so when they normalized against the code of practice, researchers were like, why did you just take away hundreds, thousands of my downloads, and now I have to remove them from my CV. And
Yeah.
it's like, this is how meaningless those numbers are. I mean,
Yeah.
not to be mean to that researcher, but it's like, this is why we need to be much more responsible in the way that we share information and we publish it out.
Great. Awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much, John. To those, please feel free. John gave his contact information. Reach out to him. If you can reach out to me if you want me to relay any questions to him, and we will get this recording posted on our YouTube page. Thank you so much, John. We greatly appreciate this information.
Thank you.
Have a good day to you and to everyone. All right. Bye.